I guess I would say that the shock and awe bombing was shocking, and it was awful. The children and some of the moms would go down into the bomb shelter, but that was basically just 4 steps down in a prayer mat. And I remember the teenagers, it was so ironic, they used to like to play the game Risk. Some of you might remember that board game. And my friend Cynthia Bannis would get tired and she'd want everybody to kind of call it a night. And so she said to the teenagers one day, you know, you could always finish the game tomorrow. And little Dima, 8 years old and with the big kids, said to her so innocently, oh, but Madame Cynthia, we might not be here tomorrow. And from Gaza, I so remember a plastic surgeon, Dr. Nabil, in the Al-Shifa hospital after the bombing had ended. And it was so terrible. Once every 11 minutes, a bomb would explode. And, you know, when finally a ceasefire was declared, the mother in the family I was staying with sat down in an overstuffed chair, and the back of her hand hit her head, her forehead, and she said, can you imagine these 22 days? I am so scared for my children. This first time I breathe. Well, the doctor said pretty much the same thing. He put his head in his hands, and he asked us how it could be that for 22 days the world watched while they were subjected to this terrible, terrible bombing. And I had mentioned last night that in the emergency room there was a doctor who actually came from one neighborhood away from mine. And his name was Dr. Othman. And so I asked him, well, I'm going back, I've got the blue passport. What would you want me to say? He was Palestinian. He went to medical school in the United States and went over to, I think, Doha, and came as a volunteer to this hospital. And he said, well, tell about these dense, inert metal explosives that lacerate a limb and there's no repair that can be made. Or tell about the white phosphorus and how, you know, if somebody's got white phosphorus under their skin and, you know, the neurosurgeons and the orthopedic surgeons are trying to repair the body, but if the subcutaneous white phosphorus is exposed to oxygen, it starts to burn again and it tortures the patient, and we doctors have to run away because then we're inhaling it. And then he stopped and he said, no, I'm completely wrong. He said, just you go back and tell people in my neighborhood that United States taxpayers paid for these weapons. And I lived near to what they called C Street and the tunnels. And I often thought, okay, maybe as rebuilding materials or food or water or medicines were coming through those tunnels, because Gaza was, you know, the world's largest open-air prison, maybe some antiquated rockets came through. I wouldn't doubt it. But if you were going to build a tunnel to accommodate what the United States was sending to Israel, the D9 bulldozers to cross over the border and knock down the trees, the Apache helicopters, the F-15 aircraft, the 500-pound bombs, the Hellfire missiles, if you were going to build a tunnel to accommodate all of that weaponry every year, your tunnel might have to look like the Grand Canyon. So the double standard, the terrible, terrible double standard, we're getting ready to possibly go to war against Iran, even though, and this happened in Iraq, didn't it? The International Atomic Energy Association is certifying, no, they're complying. They've poured cement into their plutonium reactor. They've taken their centrifuge machines offline. They're open 24/7 to our inspections. They're complying. But that's not good enough for the United States. We want that war. I shouldn't say we, I know. But the war makers, the warmongers, the warlords, how will they ever sell their weapons without another war? I mean, maybe it used to be you made weapons to fight wars, but now we make wars to sell weapons. And it's a backward kind of thing, because the greatest terror we all face is the terror of what we're doing to our own environment. So I want to tell you about some surveillance that I do approve of. I mean, it drives me nuts, actually, being in Kabul, and you look up and there are these big, huge blimps, tethered blimps, flying over the city all the time. And I don't know, maybe the cameras aren't even turned on, but feasibly they're spying on everybody below. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because billions of dollars have been put into Greyhawks and all kinds of Predator drones and Reaper drones and drones for surveillance and weaponized drones. And people know it and they feel frightened. I just had lunch recently with a youngster from Maidan, Wardak, and I asked him, well, tell me please, how is your family? And he looked down. He said, well, they told me that at this point there are so many explosions on the land from the aerial attacks that they can't find space to bury the dead. In Afghanistan. My young friends, with a spiral pad and a pen or a pencil, go up the mountainsides, up to where the widows have been pushed up to the top because there's no water available up there, so the price comes down a little bit. And I remember going into Kharib's tiny little hovel. I'd started to pass out because I'm not so good at going up the mountain, and there was no road that I could see, and it was icy, and it was cold, and I fainted, and they had to drag me in and drop me off at Kharib. And she makes tea and revives me and never stops cracking almonds. And she uses the almond shells in her Bukhari for fuel, and then she bags up the almonds, gives them to her son. He scampers down that mountaintop and he takes them to the market, and that's the income to pay the rent, to get the water. And so my young friends interview Kharib, they interview the widows, they try to learn, what's your source for water? And is the water clean? An hour-and-a-half walk? Privatized water? Non-potable water you try to boil but you don't have any fuel? And what are you using for fuel? And of course it's not coal, and of course it's not wood, and sometimes it's old shoes or tires or almond shells. And what's the age of the person who is earning an income in this family? And if it's under 12 years of age, then that piece of paper goes to the top of the deck. And then my young friends who should be having fun, who should be goofing around, and they do that too, but they spend time with their surveys, trying to figure out who most is in need of the help that good people like you send. And over the years, at least 900 big, heavy duvets. You stick the wool into the coverlet and then you sew it up. But these women are so strong. And they make those heavy blankets and then give them to the people who otherwise might freeze to death, have hypothermia in the refugee camps because they have no fuel. Or they organized a street kids' school. Because, you know, these little ones, oh, they're so cute, selling bolani, the kind of snack food, leeks inside of a pancake on the streets, or selling tissue. They're cute when they're little, washing cars or shining shoes, but they get older, and those boys are ripe for the plucking of the drug opium dealers. And those little girls, you can imagine, human trafficking. So my young friends try to cut it off as fast as they can and get these kids into a community where they'll be tutored, and the teaching is brilliant. I've been a teacher before, and I love to watch a school that works, and this is a school that works. The kids are tutored. They've become, 100 of them graduated after 3 years, and of that number 100, they were all reading and writing and doing math. And then they get, you know, they're so proud when they get the blue shirt with the wrinkle in it because it's the first time they've ever had a new piece of clothing. They get the clothing, they get the backpack, they get the pants, they get the gloves, they get the boots. And it's a brilliant project, and it starts with surveillance. Now, the United States could do that kind of surveillance, couldn't we, with our $717 billion military budget? But instead, the United States has funded one failed project after another, with corruption and greed being the hallmark of United States reconstruction in Afghanistan, as it was in Iraq. We have to tell the truth. The truth crushed to ground will rise, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said. But first, before it rises, we have to tell it. And there's a start. CNN is starting to tell the truth about Yemen. I've been amazed. I mean, they actually told about the bus and the children. And they actually showed a map of where the weapons are made in the United States and how they go over to Saudi Arabia. So of course, yes, change can happen. Can it happen fast enough to accommodate the global warming the accelerated global warming. You know, I want to share with you a quote that was in my notes from a talk in Waterloo in 2005. And this is how it goes. From the end of World War II until 1970, the Army jettisoned 64 million pounds of nerve and mustard agents in the United States, 400,000 chemical-filled bombs, landmines and rockets, and more than 500 tons of radioactive waste into the coastal waters off 11 states that virtually ring the country. Has only a vague idea where these dump sites are, has made only haphazard stabs at monitoring a few of the sites, even though leakage and container breakdown are inevitable, and has not bothered to inform the affected states or other agencies about the dumping. That was in 2005. And so the way that Wilfred Owen writes it, he says, "The angel of the Lord said, 'Lay not thy hand upon the lad. See in the thicket a ram. Offer the ram of pride instead.' But the old man would not so, and slew the son." So what is that ram of pride? The women in Baghdad. I think it could be that our pride here in the United States is that somehow we're exceptional and that we can and should be saved. The ram of pride is the militarism that we've let become our major religion now. The militarism and the militarization. And the idea that somehow our way of life, over-consumptive, over-contaminating for the landscapes and the air and the ground, that our way of life should be saved. I don't know about using the term peak oil these days, because I think it's been, scientists have said yes, no, but I believe the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is nervous that they might not be able to keep themselves at the level of expenditure that he and the other crown princes have been accustomed to, that they might start to run out. So there's Yemen, and isn't it a bit like Manifest Destiny in the United States once upon a time, taking a look at Colorado and Utah and California and saying to Mexico, we'd like to take that land, thank you. It's a land grab, I believe. I believe that Issa Bloomy, a professor from Oslo and Stockholm, is correct in saying that the Saudis are ready to bludgeon the Yemenis, bludgeon them into submission in order to take the natural gas, to take the oil, to take the very, very vital ports. And the Crown Prince has said two things that I think he wants to make us shiver. He said, a protracted war is in our favor. He went on national television and told the Saudi people, a long and protracted war is in our favor. Well, certainly it's not in the favor of the hundreds of thousands of Yemeni children expected to experience severe acute malnourishment, or the 1 million identified with cholera, or the United Nations actually doing its count is saying 18 million people in Yemen might die by the end of the year. And still the Saudis bomb an average of 3 times a day. What do they bomb? They bomb the sewage and sanitation facility and then bomb the electrical facility. You know what that means in terms of cholera. So the other thing he said was that he hoped that Yemeni children in future generations would shiver when they hear Saudi Arabia. Just the word would cause them to shiver. But I think he's probably making a very risky gamble, and that President Trump is backing up a candidate that is not actually going to have the tenacity that is being claimed. But what a scandal that he would come over here and be treated in a country that fought a revolution to say there's no such thing as royal blood, as high royalty. And what a scandal that even under the Obama administration, he could get so much weaponry, Patriot missiles, laser-guided bombs, littoral combat ships that line up along a coastline and so slow down or completely close down the importation of goods. And 80% of Yemen's goods were coming through that port of Hodeidah. So you knock that out, or you cause the United Nations Verification and Inspection Mission to by the time they search these ships inside out, slow things down to a crawl so that the food is bad or the medicines are bad by the time they get there. We saw that before in Iraq. We saw what happened when the pediatrics wards became death rows for infants. So why do they want to do it? I think it's greed. And that greed dovetails with the greed of the United States weapon makers who own Congress people. Because who's going to buy their weapons? The Saudis will buy their weapons. The Emiratis. The Emiratis are running a network of clandestine prisons where they torture people. And one method of torture is to roast people's bodies over an open fire. They truss the body to a spit and rotate them over an open fire. And we're supporting this? Amnesty International reported it. AP reported it. Human Rights Watch reported it. Why would we keep supporting the United Arab Emirates in this battle? They're taking mercenaries from the Janjaweed South Sudanese soldiers, bringing them over to fight up the coastline and help cut off the port of Hodeidah. Why are we supporting this? Then you've got Africa beset by drought and wars and floods and desperation, so much so that the people are trying to find a way to get out. But I assure you, the more dangerous crossings are the ones that the United States warlords make. But I think it's very important, especially as people try to communicate the notion of a humanitarian war, to insist that that's an oxymoron. There is no such thing as a humanitarian war. Never was, never could be. Don't buy it. But I think the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, and prior to that, the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, filing quadrennial reports 4 times a year, have made it very clear that USAID has been in collusion with some of the most despicable, shoddy, inadequate construction plans in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Why does it just get shuffled by the by? You can read about ghost hospitals, ghost healthcare facilities, including, desperately needed first aid clinics, midwife clinics. They don't even exist. There's nothing there when you look for the X on the map. And USAID puts in the budget to fund these places that don't exist. The last round of requests when John Sopko, in charge of Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, started to take a look, he said, well, hell's bells, 6 of these places are in Pakistan. Some of these X's are in Tajikistan. 1 is in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So then he really started examining it, got all of his aides, and it's not too hard to look on Google Earth. I mean, that's how we work out our walks, right? And they started to find out 80% of the places written up as healthcare facilities had serious questions about either their existence or their claims. Now, somebody is fudging. How has incarceration changed my opinion or perspective on activism and protest activities? Thank you very, very much. Yes, a very good question. I can remember women in prison saying, oh, girl, when you get out, if you organize a walk, tell our relatives. If you do something, tell our relatives. They'll want to be part of it. And I often think, with our mass incarceration, 2 million people minimum in our prisons, give each of those people 5, 6 relatives. Shouldn't there be some upswell, some surge that could make a difference? And I think to myself, how I dropped the ball. Because, when I'm outside of prison, after a while, I am really out. I start to forget. I mean, I try to stay in touch with a few, but there's nothing like being on the bunk bed, sitting with Isabel in your arms, feeling her sob. Your shoulder is wet from her tears, and she's saying, I can't do 5 more years. I can't do 5 more years. And then the other women come along. It's like they're the angels, and they say, yeah, baby, you can, and you have to, and you don't have a choice, and think of your children. And that goes on all the time. If you don't blind your eyes to the fact that Israel most likely has at least 85 thermonuclear weapons and possibly 200 to 245 thermonuclear weapons, and never will the Israelis acknowledge it, and yet we're focused on Iran, we're focused on North Korea. If somebody would level with the U.S. public and educate the U.S. public, but we remain often as undereducated as the president who's somehow in charge of this country. And other people all over the world, the kids I know in Afghanistan, they know more than an average voter in the United States. Now, this is an appalling situation. So educate, 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 as you just did now. We have to keep on educating. Letters to the editor, educate the people in the pews as best you can. You know, those of you who are Catholic, let it be known, Pope Francis has spoken, get that message into the pews. Let it be known to the rabbis, to the imams, to the Protestant ministers, that the faith-based community has got to say amen to a message that says stop the killing, stop the bloodshed, stop the torture. I think we have to keep on going to the legislative process and sitting in on the legislators' offices again and again, not necessarily risking arrest, but keep going back. Let them know you care. I think public presence is important. I think meetings, educational meetings, films, it's all important. And I know I'm talking to the choir, but sometimes we need a little tune-up together as the choir as well. It makes sense to me to recall particularly women in Iraq who sat cross-legged on the beds and held their babies and pulled us into the beds with them, and to know that they couldn't afford our despair. They couldn't afford my despair. And so I try to remember those people who I know expected that we would take their words back. And I do find that keeps me going. I'm also so grateful to novelists and storytellers who picked up their pens at a time when it had to be traumatizing to write their stories and gave us the, really wonderful novels, and that's meant a great deal to me. I remember during the shock and awe bombing, we had a book club more or less, and we read Family Matters. We read Kazuo Ishiguro's When We Were Orphans. We read so many of the stories about wars and war zones, and the journalists, would come down and we'd all share ideas together, and that it was a way to get through. And when I've been in prison, that's also been a very, very good way to get through, to keep going with other prisoners. So I'm grateful for that. My friend Chris has mentioned to me the lives of the saints, and for all the saints, there's so many people who have gone before us and who have entrusted to us their wisdom and their care. And I've been fortunate in my younger life to know some of them from my kitchen table, and that's meant a very, very great deal to me. And then you don't know what's coming around the corner. Kelly and I met each other after 9/11, and there was such grief. And the sign that was carried said, "Our grief is not a cry for war." And that was carried from the Pentagon to New York City, and people who did that walk formed Peaceful Tomorrows, and it's still there today, and it's one of the most generous, caring organizations in the world. And they immediately organized EMT workers from Ground Zero to go over to Afghanistan and meet the EMT workers there and share their stories. So you don't know what's coming around the corner. And there's so many reasons to be grateful. So I think the military must feel as though they're in pretty good shape. But I don't think, can just look to how President Trump is supporting the military. How many of you have seen camouflaged baby diapers? How many of you have been in the airport when they say the military will get on the plane first? How many of you have been at a sporting event, I mean, not me really, but where the military rappels down into the arena with weapons? I mean, that's happening in Franciscan colleges up in the Northeast. How many different kinds of ways are we being told that we're being saved by the military? Thank you for your service. You're on an Amtrak train. The ticket collector puts everything down, shakes the hand of somebody who's got a camouflage backpack. Thank you for your service. I don't at all want to express anything like contempt or rejection to anybody in the military, much less to anybody who comes back. We've got to remember every day that 22 veterans of combat commit suicide in this country. Every day. So of course we have to reach out our hands and say, how can we help? But never, never, never should we believe that our duty is to support killing and destruction and bloodshed and maiming and bullying and torture. We have to be honest. President Obama was a centrist and a militarist. What a beautiful mask compared to President Trump, who has no mask. But in a way, I know that I, Kathy Kelly, better just take off the mask. And when I look in the mirror, I better see somebody still struggling with a colonized mind, somebody still part of the small piece of the world population that's snarfing down the rest of the world's resources at cut-rate prices and using a vast arsenal to protect our way of doing it. President Bush Sr. said at an energy conference at Rio way back in 1991, he and his aides all found ways to say the American way of life is a non-negotiable. Well, look where we've gotten ourselves now. So we have to say we will negotiate. We want words to be stronger than weapons. We don't find our security in weapons. Our security is founded in extending a hand of fairness. And fairness means what Ari was saying, the women eat and the women feed their children. That's fair. We won't settle for less.